Many have probably heard that Wesley Snipes, who owed the US government around $15 million, was sentenced to 3 years in prison in 2010 and sent to a correctional facility. But that was more of a final blow to his career, which had already been faltering by that time. The troubles started much earlier. Today, let's take a look back at his career and focus on some of its most interesting moments. Snipes entered the film industry in the mid-80s, initially landing supporting roles in Hollywood movies, where he was pretty hard to notice. It wasn't until 1989 that he got some real recognition with supporting roles in Major League and King of New York. His real breakthrough came with the lead role in Spike Lee's indie film Jungle Fever. The movie received several nominations at the Cannes Film Festival, and while Wesley himself didn't win any awards, his potential was recognized, just like that of many other actors in the film. Samuel L. Jackson, for instance, landed his first major role in Jungle Fever and was actually recognized at Cannes. Jackson himself, however, once said that the praise was misplaced because he wasn't acting as an addict, he actually was one. So essentially, they praised him just for being a drug addict. The role that Wesley Snipes played could have gone to Denzel Washington. Today, Denzel is one of the highest paid stars in Hollywood. However, in the early 90s, director Spike Lee felt that Denzel looked too reserved compared to Wesley, so he gave the role to Snipes instead. The movie wasn't a massive box office hit, but Jungle Fever did manage to recoup its budget. After working with Spike Lee, Snipes' career took off, and he signed on for multiple films. One of them was the comedy White Men Can't Jump. While the movie's title plays on the common joke about white basketball players, the reality on set was quite the opposite. Woody Harrelson was actually much better at basketball than Snipes. Interestingly, Charlie Sheen was originally considered for the film, but he turned it down, saying he couldn't see himself as a basketball player. That's how Woody Harrelson landed the role. While Sheen's career was starting to stumble, White Men Can't Jump became a huge hit in the US, grossing $74 million on a budget of just $8 million. That same year, the action thriller Passenger 57 hit the big screen. Once again, Snipes got lucky. Originally, Sylvester Stallone was set to star, but he passed on Passenger 57 in favor of Cliffhanger. The producers were deeply disappointed when Sylvester Stallone turned down the lead role, and their budget was immediately cut. As a joke, they even named Tom Sizemore's character Sly. After Stallone declined, the producers tried to get Eddie Murphy for the role, but he demanded an even higher salary than what Stallone was originally offered. Nervous about Murphy's steep asking price, the studio turned to Denzel Washington, but he also declined. Only then did the role finally go to Wesley Snipes. Passenger 57 wasn't a huge blockbuster, but like Jungle Fever, it broke even and earned a small profit, which grew significantly through video sales. However, Snipes soon faced two flops. Waterdance and Boiling Point failed to capture audience interest. Since their combined budget was smaller than Passenger 57's, they didn't seriously damage his career, and producers continued offering him new projects. In 1993, he starred in two more box office hits, Demolition Man, alongside Sylvester Stallone, and Rising Sun, where he co-starred with Sean Connery. Demolition Man is one of the defining films of the early 90s, and as is often the case, it could have turned out completely different. During early development, the producers had entirely different actors in mind for the lead roles. The first choice for the lead was the rapidly rising Belgian star Jean-Claude Van Damme. He was open to the role, and the studio secured his agreement. Meanwhile, the role of the main villain was offered to Steven Seagal, whose career was also on the rise at the time. But Seagal refused to play a villain and would only agree to a role as a cop. The producers then tried to convince Van Damme to take the villain role by offering him a bigger paycheck, but he turned it down. After that, Seagal also left the project, and its development slowed down. Van Damme, meanwhile, fully immersed himself in Hard Target. Eventually, Sylvester Stallone joined the project and insisted on casting Wesley Snipes. The producers and the studio were against it, but at the time, Stallone had enough clout to ignore their objections. It wasn't that anyone disliked Snipes. Studio executives were worried that having an African-American play a mass murderer would spark unwanted controversy in the media. But Snipes was eager to take the role, and in the end, the studio relented. Snipes earned $4 million for his role in Demolition Man. In just 2 years, his paycheck jumped from $50,000 for Jungle Fever to $4 million. The film performed well at the box office, grossing $159 million on a $57 million budget. However, the studio had expected more. There were initial plans for sequels and even a prequel, with Snipes reprising his role, but after moderate box office results, all those ideas were shelved. These days, rumors occasionally surface about a possible Demolition Man reboot or even a direct sequel. Rising Sun wasn't a failure either. With a $40 million budget, it grossed $107 million worldwide. But again, the studio had higher expectations. Still, starring in these two films worked in Snipes' favor. For his next film, Drop Zone, he secured a $7 million paycheck. It was a fairly expensive film with a $45 million budget. For comparison, Speed, which came out around the same time, had a budget of just $30 million. Interestingly, Speed was originally supposed to star Steven Seagal. However, he demanded $12 million for the role. When the studio asked him to lower his fee, Seagal refused and instead took a role in Under Siege 2, where he was offered $15 million and full creative control. That left an opening, which Snipes stepped into. While audience ratings for Drop Zone were quite low, many believe its biggest setback was the failure of Terminal Velocity, which had been released just a couple of months earlier. Originally, Drop Zone was supposed to be released earlier, but due to poor test screenings, the studio ordered reshoots, pushing the release from August 1994 to December. In the end, Terminal Velocity got overshadowed by the Belgian Star and flopped. Audiences chose Time Cop instead, while Drop Zone, completely unprepared, landed in the crowded holiday season where no one cared about it. Ironically, it was also overshadowed by another Belgian-led movie, but this time, the legendary spinning kick missed its target for the first time in the street fighting ring. While it did make more than Drop Zone, audience ratings labeled it a total disaster, and Francois was falling in the rankings much faster than Wesley. In 1995, Snipes faced yet another flop. Money Train derailed completely. This was a crucial film for Sony, and they spared no expense on it. In the end, it cost a whopping $68 million. For comparison, Heat, which was released around the same time, cost $60 million, while Bad Boys had a budget of just $19 million. Even the massive GoldenEye, which was a huge hit, had a budget of $80 million. The budget was inflated to absurd levels, a brilliant move in pre-production. For Money Train, they built one of the most complex, longest, and most expensive sets in Hollywood history. Initially, they wanted to film in an actual subway system, but during pre-production, the team ran into countless obstacles. As a result, they decided to construct several subway tunnels on a studio lot. They even transported 12 subway cars from New York to Los Angeles. The subway cars were converted to run on propane, and insurance companies refused to work with the film if electrified tracks were required. On top of that, director Joseph Rubin often gets criticized. Originally, the film was supposed to be directed by Tony Scott, known for The Last Boy Scout, Enemy of the State, and Man on Fire, but due to creative differences, he left the project. Joseph Rubin took over and immediately ordered a major rewrite of the script, which significantly slowed the film's pacing. The studio did get some bonuses from the set. The set built for this movie was later used for several horror films, like Mimic and Stigmata. The movie is also known for one particular scene, a love scene between Wesley Snipes and Jennifer Lopez. It wasn't in the script, but they decided to shoot it at the very end of production. In an interview, Jennifer Lopez later revealed that in one of the movies she worked on, the director asked her to undress in a fitting room, claiming he needed to see her body. Lopez said she refused and never revealed the director's name. It's widely believed that this happened during Money Train. Money Train had no luck at the box office either. It was up against the revived James Bond franchise and the still thriving Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. Plus, on the same day, Martin Scorsese's Casino and Toy Story were released, and a week later, Wesley was hit by Jumanji and Heat. There was simply no room left in the top 10. Worldwide, Money Train made just over $70 million against a $68 million budget. At the time of its release, this made it one of the biggest flops of the year. Talk about riding the wrong wave. Honestly, it's surprising that he didn't fade away completely by the mid-90s. Right after Money Train, the fans sank as well. This was a Hollywood long-haul project. Lots of actors wanted in, but something always went wrong. Even director Tony Scott turned down the fan twice. He explained his refusal very simply. He didn't like the script at all and wasn't interested in baseball. He agreed to direct the movie only after Robert De Niro joined the cast. Scott had long wanted to work with the actor. This moment was frequently recalled in the American press later. Baseball player Joe Crook, who had been a consultant on the film, criticized Wesley Snipes and director Tony Scott after filming Wrapped. According to Crook, Snipes never quite managed to convincingly swing a bat, and Tony Scott was incredibly distant from baseball, so he wasn't interested in showing any realistic aspects of the game. Plus, during the filming of The Fan, Tony Scott signed on to direct Enemy of the State. According to the director himself, this circumstance unknowingly turned The Fan into a guinea pig as he began experimenting with various visual styles styles that he wanted to use in his future film with Will Smith. By the way, Brad Pitt could have played the role that went to Snipes, but he turned the offer down. In response, Pitt suggested his own candidacy for the role that later went to Robert De Niro, but the producers thought Pitt was too good-looking for such a role, fearing he wouldn't be able to scare anyone with his appearance, so they declined. Originally, Wesley Snipes also wanted to play De Niro's role, but the studio convinced him that as a baseball star, he would be more natural. The film's reviews were far from satisfactory. At the box office, it was even beaten by the flop The Island of Dr. Moreau, which came out around the same time. And it was finally crushed by Tin Cup, starring Kevin Costner, who was already on the decline in his star power. But The Fan was still enough for that. With a budget of $55 million, The Fan couldn't even gather $20 million at the American box office. At one point, Wesley and Francois could have shared a film called Sandstorm, but the still self-confident Belgian once again refused to play the villain, and in the end, the project fell apart, never getting out of production. Instead of Sandstorm, Snipes decided to pick up a police thriller that had fallen through Bruce Willis's hands. The thriller became Murder at 1600. After Willis's departure, the film was heading toward cancellation. Fearing that the money spent on preparation for filming would just go down the drain, the studio agreed to pay Snipes a record fee of $10 million at the time. One could say the film wasn't lucky with its release timing. If everything had gone smoothly, with Willis in the lead role, it would have been released in 1996. But due to all the delays, it only hit theaters in 1997, when the market was already oversaturated with political thrillers related to the White House, and they were flopping left and right. Nearby, Shadow Conspiracy and Clint Eastwood's Absolute Power also flopped. In worldwide box office, Wesley Snipes' $40 million film earned $41 million. 1998 started badly for Wesley as well. The sequel to The Fugitive flopped. Critics completely trashed U.S. Marshals, and Robert Downey Jr., who played a role in it, considers it one of the worst films in Hollywood history. Perhaps this year could have marked the beginning of the end for Wesley, but by the end of the year, Blade hit the screens, which for a time became a saving grace for the actor. Wesley Snipes really wanted to play Black Panther. The superhero film was being developed in the late 90s. At this point, he was offered the role of Blade, thinking the Black Panther film was still much further from production. He agreed to play the main vampire antagonist. Concerned about his future, Wesley tried to get involved in every detail related to the film. According to Stephen Dorff, they initially didn't get along. Snipes is a big fan of improvisation and reacted quite harshly to advice from others. As the film's producer, he believed he had to guide Dorff in the right direction for the film. Because of this, there were a few altercations during filming that almost escalated into a fight. However, over time, the actors warmed up to each other, and in the end, they speak highly of their collaboration. By the way, in one interview, screenwriter David Goyer mentioned that director David Fincher helped him with the script, who, after Seven, wanted to try his hand at a different genre. But for unknown reasons, Fincher ended his collaboration and moved on to other projects. So theoretically, the film could have been quite different. No one believed in this film when it was released. It was predicted to be a box office failure because it was the next comic book film after Batman and Robin. Analysts believed audiences would ignore a movie about a lesser-known hero, especially right after such a disastrous film as Batman and Robin. However, Blade managed to dethrone Saving Private Ryan from the top of the US box office. With a budget of $45 million, Blade grossed $131 million worldwide. This result wasn't a huge success, but the film did very well on home video. So, as soon as the film hit home video, the studio immediately announced a sequel. It was during this period of his career that Wesley Snipes started evading taxes, which would ultimately lead to his imprisonment in 2010. Although Blade saved the actor's career, he didn't become more selective with his projects. Instead, he signed on to films where they paid him more money. Among them was his work with the infamous Franchise Pictures studio, which, for its knack for slicing budgets in the early 2000s, was dragged to court and subsequently went bankrupt. Interestingly, the film The Art of War from this studio was probably Wesley's last film, aside from the Blade series, that had any box office potential. But due to various scandals and an insane budget that couldn't even be seen with a magnifying glass, the film lost its American distributor, Fox, and went to Warner, which, without much promotion, threw it into theaters. The film, with a $60 million budget, the same as The Matrix, earned $30 million. Since all non-vampire films with Wesley Snipes were flopping, by the mid-2000s, the actor had resorted to projects that went straight to video, bypassing theatrical release. And when Blade 3 flopped in 2004, Snipes' star career essentially ended. After his role in the failed Chaos in 2005, which was still released in theaters, Wesley started appearing in films that couldn't couldn't even be classified as B-movies. He went to prison at the end of 2010, and although he was acquitted on some charges, he was ultimately sentenced to 3 years for tax evasion in the 90s and early 2000s. He was facing a much harsher sentence, and the guys who were handling Snipes' money went away for a vacation of 10 years. But when you have a lot of money, there are certain mitigating factors that the court took into account, and Wesley got just 3 years, serving 2 of them. In early 2013, Snipes was released from prison, and Sylvester Stallone invited him to the Expendables 3, where he got one of the lead roles. However, the role didn't positively affect the actor's career, and there was no real comeback. After the Expendables, Snipes returned to action films of an unclear category, whose ratings on specialized sites rarely reach 4 out of 10. In recent years, Eddie Murphy has often helped him by inviting him to small roles in his films. One such role was in Coming to America, which was released directly on streaming services. Most likely, when Wesley Snipes' career started to decline in the early 2000s, he could have saved himself by lowering his fees and trying to land better films. But alas, he chose a different path, as many before him did. In the end, the actor became bankrupt and lost almost all of his possessions, the ones everyone knows about, since Wesley tried to prove in court that he wasn't a US citizen, and therefore everything he did was perfectly legal. We can assume that somewhere on the sunny Bahamas, he has a little treasure chest of gold, albeit not that huge. Thank you for your attention. Stay tuned.